Han Feng, originally a Special Forces soldier, had accidentally traveled back in time to the primitive Stone Age, reborn as an 8-year-old child.
Here, it wasn't just starving most of the time, he didn't even have a decent pair of pants, yet he never wavered for a moment.
With experience from his past life, survival in this primitive world was nothing particularly daunting. At this moment, several women wrapped in animal hides were curiously watching Han Feng.
He ignored them, grabbed a stone knife and slashed hard at his snake-bitten ankle, then pressed a burning branch onto the wound. After 3 agonizing screams, Han Feng went limp and collapsed face down onto the dirt.
He could only hope his instructor hadn't lied. That high temperature could really coagulate the protein in snake venom. After a night on the edge of death, Han Feng bounced back the next morning, resilient as ever.
He grabbed a piece of dried meat from a woman's hand and devoured it ravenously. Seeing he could eat normally again, the woman called out to the others to prepare and head out.
Han Feng quickly grabbed the woman's arm and gestured to ask for more food. The woman shook her head. She couldn't possibly give him more. The tribe had barely over 50 people, and daily food was strictly limited.
On top of that, this was the peak season for stockpiling food for the coming winter, so food would be prioritized for able-bodied adults. If food ran short, the disabled like him would be the very first ones abandoned.
At that thought, Han Feng could no longer stay calm.
The weather was turning cold. He needed to quickly find a way to stockpile food for winter. After careful thought, he realized the easiest protein source available right now was fish. There was a small river less than a kilometer away, but the tribe didn't eat fish and had no tools to catch them.
Besides the stone knife used to cut the wound, all Han Feng had was a 3 to 4 meter snakeskin cord from the very snake that had bitten his ankle yesterday. He cursed under his breath and set out to find materials, planning to gather vine to weave into fish-catching baskets.
Since this ecosystem was still completely pristine and nobody had ever fished here, there must be fish in abundance. A short while later, Han Feng returned to the cave entrance with a large bundle of vine and began weaving baskets. Several children crowded around, curiously watching him, making inarticulate sounds and unable to form words.
The children stared wide-eyed at something they had never seen before, mouths open, not knowing what to say. Nearby, some women were drying reed bundles at the cave entrance. Those would be their beds and blankets come winter. Just then, a distant scream suddenly rang out. Following the sound, Han Feng saw the bearded tribal chief and 2 other men sprinting and shouting, clutching enormous bird eggs.
At the same moment, a piercing screech tore through the air. A terror bird over 3 meters tall was closing fast on the chief. Han Feng shouted, "Drop the eggs now!" But nobody understood a word he said. The chief refused to let go of the eggs, and the terror bird refused to give up its prey. Soon the chief was overtaken, one lethal strike, and he was dead on the spot. The 2 other men immediately dropped their eggs and fled into the forest, climbing trees to barely escape alive. The children around Han Feng, never having participated in the hunt and never having seen anything so terrifying, screamed and wailed in panic. The terror bird had lost its prey, but the children's screams drew its attention. It whipped around and charged straight toward the cave entrance. The women inside saw this and immediately pulled the children, including Han Feng, inside, then together shoved a large round boulder to seal the cave entrance. When only a 30-centimeter gap remained, the enormous beak thrust through, but the creature's body was far too large to follow. Everyone was temporarily safe. Even so, the small children kept sobbing in fear.
Han Feng roared, "Shut up, every one of you! Anyone still crying, I'll throw outside."
Although the children didn't understand the words, his ferocious expression was enough to silence them all instantly. Unable to break through the boulder, the terror bird let out a few frustrated cries and moved off. Seeing this, Han Feng carefully crept to the entrance and peered outside through the gap. The clearing in front of the cave was empty of people, but the terror bird hadn't left. It had returned to the chief's body and begun feeding. Han Feng clenched his jaw and made his decision. The terror bird had to be eliminated. It had now tasted human flesh and knew the tribe's location. The tribe would never be safe again.
But he had no real weapons. Fighting it with a wooden stick would be no different from suicide. Just then, looking at the terror bird's 2 long legs, a sudden idea flashed in Han Feng's mind. He immediately got to work, picked up 2 fist-sized stones, unwound the snakeskin cord from his waist, and tied a stone to each end.
Bola finished, Han Feng gripped the improvised weapon and squeezed through the narrow boulder gap to get outside. Those inside were stunned and wanted to stop him, but feared drawing the terror bird, so they could only watch helplessly.
Han Feng crept through the brush and stopped when he was approximately 5 to 6 meters from the terror bird. At this moment, the terror bird was still completely absorbed in its meal, utterly unaware that a former soldier who had made enemies tremble was taking aim at it. Han Feng silently stood up, grabbed the midpoint of the snakeskin cord, and began spinning it rapidly. The 2 stones flew outward, stretching the cord taut under centrifugal force. The terror bird sensed the movement, snapped its head up with a fierce cry, and charged straight at Han Feng. Seeing it close and fast, the women and children inside the cave screamed for him to run. But Han Feng stood absolutely still. When the terror bird was only 3 meters away, he suddenly hurled the bola at it with full force. The cord flew true. The moment it touched the terror bird's 2 legs, it snapped tight around them. The terror bird was now just 1 meter from Han Feng. It lost balance and crashed to the ground, its tiny wings flapping uselessly, unable to rise. The women and children inside the cave stared with open mouths, unable to believe what they were seeing. Han Feng immediately called 2 youths over and told them to pin the bird's neck down, while he hoisted a large flat rock and drove it hard onto the creature's skull. Blood sprayed everywhere. The terror bird stopped struggling. The 2 youths, apparently stirred by the sight of blood, grabbed stones and kept smashing the bird's head. One final thud, it was dead. The 2 youths looked at Han Feng with eyes full of wordless reverence, not knowing what to say. They gazed at him in silent awe. Something had fundamentally changed between them. Han Feng untied the bola from the bird's legs, rewound it at his waist, then signaled the 2 boys to help drag the carcass back to the cave. The 2 youths now followed Han Feng without question, proper little subordinates. The 3 of them dragged the terror bird back together. Seeing the 3 of them arrive with such enormous prey, those inside couldn't hold back. They shoved the boulder aside and rushed out to help. The 2 men who had fled up the trees had also climbed down. They had witnessed the entire process of Han Feng killing the terror bird single-handed and were deeply awed. Back at the cave, Han Feng told the women to keep the feathers for him and handle the rest however they liked. Danger was over. He had baskets to finish. About an hour later, both baskets were complete. Han Feng loaded the terror bird's innards into a basket and headed toward the riverbank. On the way, a woman saw him heading to the river alone and quietly followed. In her mind, he was too capable to be left unguarded. The 2 boys who had newly pledged loyalty also tagged along curiously. The 4 of them quickly arrived at the riverbank. Han Feng stood on the bank observing. The more he looked, the more his jaw dropped. In just a few minutes, he watched several large fish devour smaller ones. There were predatory fish in there, but the ecosystem here was extraordinary. Crystal clear water visible all the way to the bottom, and fish absolutely everywhere. Han Feng selected a spot, loaded some bird innards into the basket, gripped the vine cord firmly, and lowered it into the river. The smell of meat spread quickly through the water. Fish within 20 meters erupted into a frenzy, swarming toward the basket to fight over the bait. Han Feng suddenly yanked the basket upward, 4 large fish still thrashing inside. But the fish in the river showed no sign of fleeing. They clustered below, still fighting over the remaining bait. The scene reminded him of feeding koi in a park. He couldn't help laughing out loud. These fish had never encountered a trap before and couldn't even recognize something this simple. The 2 boys and the woman were utterly amazed. You just put that strange thing in the water and pull it up, and you get legless creatures from below? What they were actually for, they still didn't understand. Han Feng dumped the 4 fish onto the bank. cleaned them, and cut a slice of raw sashimi to eat. Seeing him eat raw fish with obvious enjoyment, they immediately understood it was food and imitated him, each cutting a piece for themselves.
The woman's eyes lit up. She immediately recognized a new food source and urgently gestured for Han Feng to teach her how to catch fish. But Han Feng didn't let her fish. Instead, he assigned tasks. The woman and one boy cleaned fish. The other boy strung them on a stick with grass to carry back to the tribe.
Han Feng continued fishing. With all the fish gathered in one spot, he simply squatted on the bank and scooped with the basket repeatedly, catching plenty each time.
They worked steadily until noon, catching over 200 fish, the largest weighing roughly 10 kilograms each. The three of them couldn't possibly carry it all, so he sent one boy sprinting back to fetch older kids for help.
Finally, the entire group formed a carrying chain and made their way back to the cave together. The foraging and hunting teams had already returned. Without proper tools, adults could only catch rabbits and wild chickens, small game. Just then, the children hauling the fish reached the cave entrance, shouting and boasting to the adults about their massive haul.
The children hit the cave entrance, yelling and waving strings of fish above their heads, competing to tell the story first.
The adults had been somewhat grieving the chief's death, but seeing Han Feng's astonishing haul instantly swept their sorrow away. The chief's death was quickly pushed to the back of their minds.
After processing the catch, the entire tribe assembled in the clearing in front of the cave. A large pyre of firewood had been stacked there, with the chief's body placed on top. An old man wearing 2 goat horns on his head touched a torch to the pyre, and flames rose quickly to engulf the chief's body. Firelight fell across every face. The children, smelling roasted meat, had mouths watering. They showed no grief at all. The adults were calm too, now that a new food source had been secured.
Han Feng used this opportunity to survey the tribe. There were currently 52 people, 8 adult men, 15 women, and children of all ages.
The one who had lit the fire was the tribal elder, the oldest member, recognized by everyone as the wisest. But now he might have to settle for second place, as Han Feng was slowly replacing him in the tribe's hearts. There was also a 6-fingered man whose favorite weapon was a wooden club. He seemed rather dim-witted, likely from inbreeding. Standing next to 6 Fingers was a man with a feather necklace who looked sharp and cunning, also fond of the club. Behind Feather Necklace stood Stone Head, wearing a bone necklace with a stone axe as his weapon. Slightly apart stood a youth of about 15 named One Ear. He had only his right ear, with 4 scars on the left side of his face, and a weapon made from a sharpened thigh bone. Next to One Ear stood Beast Fang, son of the previous chief, wielding 2 saber-toothed tiger fangs, each over a foot long. And then there was Giant Force, the tallest and most muscular in the tribe, whose weapon of choice was simply a human femur bone. Finally, there was Stone Grinder, leaning on his staff, currently assigned to the foraging team as a pathfinder. He loved grinding stone. Reportedly, his greatest dream in life was to grind himself a stone water basin. Overall, One Ear, Beast Fang, and Giant Force were the strongest warriors in the tribe. When the cremation ended, night had fully fallen. Under the elder's direction, everyone moved inside the cave to distribute food. Since they had never eaten fish before, Han Feng was given a special extra portion. He held up a pre-roasted fish and demonstrated how to eat it and remove the bones. Everyone followed his example and ate with relish. Perhaps because it was the first time they had eaten their fill, they were all joyful, eating and dancing at the same time. The scene before him made Han Feng feel an unexpected warmth, like home. He silently vowed that he would lead this tribe to a better life. When everyone had eaten, the goat-horned elder took a charred stick and carefully drew the scene of Han Feng catching fish at the riverbank onto the cave wall. Han Feng, meanwhile, taught the women how to weave baskets. He added 2 shoulder straps to make carry baskets. After this, they wouldn't need animal hides to carry fruit, greatly improving harvest efficiency. The women loved the carry baskets on site, taking turns wearing them and reluctant to hand them to the next person. Finally, they discussed that tomorrow they would go get more vine to weave their own. As thanks, they selected the 2 finest deerskins from the foraging team and presented them to Han Feng. Thus, he became the first child in the tribe to wear animal hide clothing. But Han Feng wasn't selfish. He kept one skin and gave the other to mothers of toddlers aged 2 or 3, telling them to make clothes for their children. Children's immunity was extremely weak, and with no medical knowledge in this primitive era, even a simple cold could cost a child their life. So this deerskin was practically equivalent to saving a life. The next morning, Han Feng rose very early. After completing his military calisthenics, he felt a bit thirsty, but looking at the shared communal stone water basin, he didn't dare drink from it. It was clearly time to make some proper water containers. The tribe gradually woke up, but today they weren't in a hurry to go hunting. The elder assembled all adult men in the clearing in front of the cave. In his hands, he held the green feathered hat, the symbol of the chief's authority. Clearly, he wanted to elect a new leader. In the elder's hands was the green feathered hat, the symbol of the chief's authority, held aloft in both hands, beginning the tribal election ceremony. Han Feng paid no attention to them and turned to head toward the river. After all, he wasn't yet of adult age and had no standing to participate in any election.
But he had barely taken 2 steps before One Ear called out and pulled him back toward the elder. Still confused, Han Feng watched as the elder spoke and gestured, conveying roughly that his strength had been recognized by everyone and he was being invited to compete. Since the position of chief was at stake, Han Feng naturally wouldn't pass up this opportunity. Only by becoming chief could he give orders to everyone. The method of selecting a chief was simple. No weapons, no serious injury allowed. Whoever proved the best would become the next chief. Since his physique was no advantage, Han Feng wasn't the first to step forward to challenge. First, One Ear faced off against Beast Fang. The two exchanged blows, nothing flashy, primarily a test of raw strength. One Ear lacked stamina but had excellent explosive power. Before long, he found his moment, tackled Beast Fang, and pinned him to the ground. Beast Fang struggled several times but couldn't get up and breathlessly admitted defeat. One Ear looked at the green feathered hat in the elder's hands and let out an excited roar, both celebrating his victory and challenging Giant Force. Giant Force immediately stepped forward. Standing nearly 2 meters tall, he was like an iron tower. One Ear suddenly didn't know how to attack him, but didn't waver for a moment, roared, and launched the first strike. But the moment he closed the range, Giant Force caught him by both shoulders with hands the size of fans. Before he could react, he heard a massive roar and found himself launched sideways through the air, crashing down meters away in a tumble he couldn't recover from. Giant Force triumphantly beat his chest and turned to receive the hat from the elder. The tribe erupted in cheers, ready to recognize him as the new chief. Just then, an out-of-place voice rang out. "Wait, I'm still here!" Han Feng stepped forward and snatched a feathered hat directly from Giant Force's outstretched grip, feathers scattering to the ground. Giant Force angrily beat his chest and roared in fury. But Han Feng showed no fear. He gripped the hat even tighter and announced to the tribe in their own limited vocabulary, "I defeat him. I am chief." The onlookers immediately murmured. Nobody seemed to object. And so, before everyone's astonished eyes, Han Feng and Giant Force stepped into the ring. Giant Force looked down at Han Feng, who barely reached his chest, his eyes full of smug confidence and contempt. The watching children howled and cheered for Han Feng. Han Feng didn't hesitate. He launched forward instantly. His left foot planted on Giant Force's thigh for elevation, then his right knee drove hard into the man's jaw. Han Feng's right knee drove upward into Giant Force's jaw in a precise flying impact. Before anyone could react, Giant Force crashed face first to the ground, rolling and groaning. The entire tribe froze in shocked silence. The elder suddenly became agitated. An intense feeling, irrational but powerful, welled up in him. This child before him might cause the entire tribe to become something greater. Before the elder had even raised a gesture, the tribe had already lifted Han Feng into the air, cheering and celebrating their new chief. The elder picked up the damaged green feathered hat that Han Feng had torn apart,
looking at him with a somewhat bewildered expression. The heirloom, passed down through countless generations of chiefs, was now destroyed. But the elder didn't know Han Feng had destroyed the hat on purpose, as if wearing a ridiculous cluster of bright green feathers on his head was absolutely out of the question. By now, Giant Force had recovered somewhat. Still not accepting the result, he charged through the celebrating crowd straight at Han Feng.
Seeing him coming, Han Feng immediately jumped down. As Giant Force closed in, Han Feng grabbed two of his fingers and bent them sharply forward, then slipped around behind him and kicked the back of his knee.
Giant Force crashed to the ground. The more he struggled, the more it hurt. Less than 2 minutes later, even someone as powerful as him was crying and begging for mercy. Han Feng dusted off his hands, released the bawling giant, and turned to walk calmly into the cave. The crowd erupted again, the children celebrating wildly. For the first time ever, a person below adult age had beaten a full-grown man. Just then, Han Feng appeared before everyone with a completely new look. He wore a simple deerskin vest, his long black hair neatly tied up with a snakeskin cord, clean, tidy, and looking every bit the part. This new appearance was something Han Feng had carefully planned. Reportedly, this style dated back to the Shang and Zhao dynasties. Early farmers found long, loose hair inconvenient for fieldwork, and so tied it up.
Under the admiring gazes of the entire tribe, Han Feng walked to the center of the crowd and began assigning the day's work. First, he reorganized the foraging team. Currently, there were 15 adult women in the tribe, 6 pregnant, and the remaining 9 plus Stone Grinder made 10. Now that they had carry baskets, Stone Grinder didn't need to guard the foragers. Each person carrying a stick was enough. Everyone had a task now, but Stone Grinder had been left without an assignment and seemed a bit deflated. For this man who dreamed all his life of grinding a stone basin, Han Feng planned to put him in charge of pottery firing. But yesterday's fish hadn't been dried yet. Without salt, they would rot fast. So Han Feng demonstrated smoke curing once for Stone Grinder and handed the whole operation over to him. He found a flat area in front of the cave and began digging a kiln structure. The entire kiln was divided into 3 tiers, the bottom for ash collection and ventilation, the middle for fuel, the top for pottery. The 3-tier structure, bottom for ash, middle for fuel, top for pottery. Han Feng traced it in the dirt for anyone watching to understand. It took 3 to 4 hours to finish building the kiln. Since newly built kilns were too damp to use immediately, he called the 2 boys from yesterday's fishing trip to load firewood into each tier and light the fire. It would be ready by this afternoon. With tasks arranged, Han Feng personally went to the riverbank to select clay. He found a large, smooth, flat stone as his work surface, then kneaded and pounded the clay into a round disc. He then rolled long clay ropes and coiled them upward layer by layer onto the disc base, pressing each join tight with wet fingertips until the surface was smooth. Coiling clay ropes upward layer by layer, wall rising from the base, fingers pressing each join tight until structurally sound. Very quickly, the first piece was finished, a small jar with a narrow base and wide open mouth. He then used the same method to produce 4 more in rapid succession, setting all of them in a ventilated spot beside the cave entrance and instructing the 2 fire-tending boys to guard them and let nobody touch them. Next came several 2-handled cooking pots and over 20 bowls, along with a few small pieces. These didn't need to be beautiful, only functional. In his heart, Han Feng wasn't sure how many pieces would survive the firing. As evening fell, he loaded all the greenware into the kiln one by one. Stone Grinder in particular had a complicated expression, hoping the pieces would succeed and hoping they'd fail, not sure which side he was on. As evening fell, Han Feng loaded all the greenware into the kiln. The 2 boys and Stone Grinder stood watching intently as the new chief filled the kiln with more clay pieces than any of them had ever seen made in a single day. Stone Grinder in particular had conflicted feelings, hoping the clay pieces would work and hoping they wouldn't. If they did, all those years grinding stone basins would have been for nothing. Han Feng paid no attention to them. He squatted by the kiln, feeding fuel and fanning steadily with animal hide, keeping this up until well into the night. The tribe's work teams returned one by one from the day's labors. The foraging team had an abundant harvest, baskets packed with fruit, and a large bundle of vine ready for weaving more carry baskets. The hunting team also had an excellent haul: 2 large turkey-sized birds, 2 large snakes, over 10 bird eggs, over 10 field mice, a pack of chestnuts, plus over 100 fish caught that day.
Looking through the observation hole, the pieces inside were starting to glow white. Han Feng felt they were nearly done and let the fire die down naturally, planning to let them cool overnight and open the kiln in the morning.
After a hard day's work, everyone in the tribe was exhausted, but gathered around the fire, every face wore a genuinely happy smile. They no longer had to worry about going hungry. Most importantly, Han Feng had baked the 2 large birds in clay, a clay-baked delicacy they had never tasted anything like.
But Han Feng didn't find it satisfying. The dishes had only a sprinkle of crude salt and had essentially no detectable saltiness. He quietly calculated whether they could use pottery to trade for more salt. When everyone had eaten, the women went back to the cave to weave baskets. Han Feng, meanwhile, distributed all the remaining animal hides. Crowded together a bit, the children could now sleep under a blanket. The next morning, Han Feng went straight to check the pottery results the moment he woke. Stone Grinder was already there, urgently pulling the elder over and saying something with intense excitement. Han Feng himself was filled with anticipation. The salt trade plan and the long-dreamed-of pot of meat soup all depended on this. With a racing heart, he opened the kiln cover and peered inside. Every piece was brick red. The surface had started to melt slightly from the intense heat, but had glazed to a glossy sheen far beyond anything he had imagined. Seeing this, Stone Grinder grabbed a bowl in excitement and ran his hands over it in disbelief. Then he dropped his ever-present staff and jogged back toward the cave. Soon he returned running with a bowl full of water, shouting excitedly for the whole tribe to come see this beautiful water-holding vessel. Han Feng smiled and continued unloading the kiln. 4 pottery jars and 4 small vats had fired perfectly, smooth surfaces, not a single crack. Of 20-plus bowls, 12 were usable. As each piece of brick-red pottery came out, the tribe looked on with a mix of amazement and excitement. Beast Fang and Giant Force each grabbed a large jar and sprinted to the river, returning soon after with both jars filled to the brim with water. The elder was excited but managed to stay composed, gesturing and asking Han Feng how it was done. Before Han Feng could answer, the 2 boys from yesterday jumped in to explain. It was made by firing clay. But Han Feng's main concern was the salt trade. When he gestured to ask the elder looked at him the way one looks at a child about to waste a family fortune. The elder pointed at the pottery, large and small, then at the tribe members both young and old, painfully explaining to Han Feng just how valuable these pieces truly were. Han Feng was stunned. A single bowl alone could be traded for a near-adult youth or 2 young women, to say nothing of jars and pots. But Han Feng didn't see it that way. More people meant more food, more fighting strength. New members also meant new bloodlines for the tribe, at minimum reducing the rate of children born with conditions like 6 fingers. Thinking this through, Han Feng immediately arranged the trade mission. The elder and 7 hunters would carry a jar, a pot, and 3 bowls in backpacks to trade for people and salt. The jar would trade for 2 adult women, the pot for 2 near-adult youths, all 3 bowls for salt. If no salt was available, use the bowls for young women instead. People first. With that settled, the group departed immediately. Han Feng turned to arrange work assignments for those remaining. The trading tribe was to the west, over a mountain and across a valley. They arrived quickly. This tribe was slightly larger than Han Feng's, with a population of around 90 people. Seeing the elder arrive with his group, the opposing tribe's bald chief came forward to meet them. After a brief greeting, the elder produced a bowl and presented it. Bald Chief's eyes lit up. The bowl was smooth and far lighter than their stone basins. He sent someone for a small bag of salt to give the elder, but the elder took it, looked it over, and shook his head. "We want more, and this time we also want 2 adult women in exchange."
Then he had Giant Force bring out the large jar. Bald Chief froze. The jar was enormous. Something this big could hold so much more water.
But then he hesitated. 2 women for a basin this large was clearly a great bargain, but it was autumn, harvest season. 1 fewer person meant 1 fewer share of the harvest.
But in the end, he smiled and agreed. 1 fewer mouth to feed meant 1 fewer food portion to provide. That worked in his favor. Soon, 2 thin, bare women were brought forward. They were adult sisters. The older one held a boy of about 4. The boy lay still with his eyes closed, clearly ill.
We trade these 2 for your large basin. The child is a free gift for you. Bald Chief waved his hand with an expression of distaste, as if he just wanted them out of his sight.
Seeing this, the elder followed what the new chief had instructed him that morning: cook a pot of meat soup right on the spot.
Soon, rich meat aromas drifted from the pot, and the opposing tribespeople swallowed involuntarily. So meat could be cooked this way? They had never imagined it.
Bald Chief eagerly accepted a bowl from the elder. Inside were several braised meat pieces and broth. He hesitated, then took 1 slow, careful sip. In an instant, he was stunned. Heavens, it was so delicious. The broth was salty and fragrant with a shimmering layer of fat on top. The meat was tender and rich. 1 bite, and his whole body felt reinvigorated.
Those boys? Deal. Absolutely deal. Bald Chief became instantly generous, cheerfully handing over the people. He even ordered his men to bring out a large sack of salt that filled Giant Force's entire backpack. The elder nodded in satisfaction, and the whole group set off homeward. They had left as 7. With the 9 newly acquired people, they returned as 16.
They hurried and finally arrived at the tribe as evening neared. But the newly acquired people entering the clearing in front of the cave stopped in their tracks, utterly stunned by what they saw. When the elders' group returned, they were equally stunned. In front of the cave, alongside the old pottery, were 4 new jars, 4 pots, and a pile of freshly fired bowls. Stone Grinder stood blankly, admiring the pottery. This was the happiest day of his life. In another corner of the clearing, hundreds of large fish hung drying on racks, the women nearby all smiling brightly. The elder brought everyone to report to Han Feng, 8 people plus 1 child. Han Feng squinted and looked each one over, all of them thin as sticks, clearly low-quality goods. Finally, Han Feng stopped before the woman holding the child. The boy lay still, his face flushed red. Han Feng pressed a hand to the child's forehead, hot as a burning coal. Han Feng quickly pulled the woman into the cave, found an animal hide to wrap around both of them, and settled them close by the fire to get warm. Then he paced anxiously. There was no medicine of any kind. How to bring the fever down? Suddenly his eyes lit up. That's right, gua sha can reduce fever. He immediately got to work, first cooking a light fish soup over the fire, then finding something suitable for gua sha scraping. The terror bird's beak was over half a meter long. Break off a piece and it would be perfect. The woman holding her child didn't know what Han Feng was planning. Earlier, when he touched her son's forehead, he had frowned. She was terrified he was going to throw her child away. Just then, Han Feng walked up holding the bird beak shard. "Give me the child. I can save him." The woman didn't understand the words, but sensed he was kinder than the previous chief. Timidly, she handed the child over. Han Feng used the bone shard to scrape red marks across the child's body. The semi-conscious boy winced in pain and cried continuously. Seeing this, the mother lunged to snatch back her child, but was held firmly by 2 women. Han Feng applied the warm, smooth shard to the sleeping boy's back in steady healing motions. The boy lay peacefully under the warm firelight. After a while, Han Feng returned the red-marked child to the mother, then ladled fish soup and fed it to the child 1 careful spoonful at a time. The child, who hadn't eaten in who knew how long, swallowed every drop eagerly the moment soup touched his lips. Han Feng exhaled with relief. Still eating means still savable. Just needed him to break a sweat and the life would be secured. Han Feng exhaled quietly. As long as the child could still swallow, he could be saved. The hard part was done. Just wait for the fever to break. The woman finally relaxed.
She didn't understand what he had done, but clearly he hadn't harmed her child. The moment she relaxed, her stomach growled. 2 days without eating, and the sight of fish soup made her mouth water uncontrollably. Han Feng set a full bowl of fish soup in front of her, along with a large piece of fish. He gestured clearly, "Eat." Then he gently took the sleeping child from the mother's arms so she could eat freely, holding the boy wrapped in animal hide against his chest. Han Feng's mind was churning. Just a minor fever could cost a life here. To stockpile enough animal hides, they had to hunt large game. There was no other way.
He selected a straight piece of firewood and bound a sharpened terror bird leg bone to one end, producing a bone-tipped spear. Then he took a piece of the terror bird's beak and ground it into a dagger. The remaining materials he gave to Stone Grinder, telling him to make another set. For now, equipment meant only these 2 things. Everything had to be handmade. Han Feng held the completed bone staff across his open palms. Straight shaft, bone tip, tight vine binding. He checked the balance. Han Feng handed Stone Grinder the remaining beak material and the completed staff as a template. Make another one just like this. The next morning, when everyone was up, Han Feng issued new assignments. Stone Grinder continues pottery. First priority was ensuring every person had a bowl. Adult women split into 2 teams, one foraging fruit, one fishing. The hunting team was led personally by Han Feng. All hunters, plus the 2 boys who always followed him, a total of 11 people, boldly entered the dense forest. Inside the forest, the hunters spread out to hunt individually. Han Feng led the 4 boys, Big Mouth, Monkey, Big Mao, and Little Mao.
Most trees in this forest were chestnut trees. Chestnuts carpeted the ground below them, and large birds could be seen foraging in the distance. But throughout the walk, Han Feng only observed. He never hunted anything.
A skilled hunter first maps out what's in his hunting ground. The boys following behind grew impatient. Several times they saw pheasants eating chestnuts and nearly moved to strike. Han Feng ignored them completely and kept calculating.
This large mountain was a complete food chain. From tracks and droppings on the ground, he could read the story. Very quickly, Han Feng found wild boar sign. From the chaotic pattern of tracks, he could tell it was a whole herd, but the depth of the prints alarmed him. These animals weighed at least 1,000 pounds each. Finally, they crossed the mountain peak. Han Feng's eyes lit up. Ahead, a silver stream sparkled across the valley, its banks lined with enormous aloe vera plants. At the water's edge, over a dozen large tapir boars were drinking. The alpha male was estimated at around 1,500 pounds, followed by 3 sows and several piglets already the size of domestic pigs. Charging directly at animals like this was out of the question. Traps were the better option. Han Feng quietly crept back into the forest. The boys were terrified and didn't dare make a sound. They had only been thinking of catching pheasants or digging up mice. Targets like these had never crossed their minds. He began setting snares himself, tying grass rope loops near the boar tracks, each secured to a large root. Once a boar stepped into a loop, it would auto-tighten, and the more it struggled, the tighter it would get. To ensure safety, per Han Feng's arrangement, all 4 boys climbed up into the trees. Now all that was needed was to make the boar herd turn. Han Feng circled to the other side of the stream, covered himself in river mud for total camouflage, and hid in the brush. Then he raised 2 large branches overhead, suddenly leaped out, screaming at the top of his lungs, driving the boar herd into flight. Having never seen anything like this creature, the boars stampeded into the forest. Han Feng chased close behind, running and screaming continuously, driving the entire herd toward the snare zone. Han Feng charged after at full sprint, screaming continuously. Before long, he heard desperate pig squeals ahead. When they reached the snare zone, Han Feng could see 2 boars struggling, the alpha male and a young immature sow, both caught in the snares. The grass ropes couldn't hold them long. Han Feng gripped his bone spear and carefully advanced, waiting for the exact right moment, then drove one decisive thrust into the alpha boar's open mouth. Han Feng drove the bone spear forward in one decisive controlled thrust. The sharp tip pierced straight through the back of the alpha's neck. The sharp tip pierced straight through the back of its neck.
Blood sprayed profusely, and soon the 1,500-pound beast collapsed to the ground. With just 5 children, how could this enormous beast get home? Looking at the still struggling sow beside it, an idea suddenly crystallized in Han Feng's mind.
Han Feng looked at the struggling sow. The solution became clear. He immediately got to work implementing it. First, he tied the sow to a tree trunk with grass rope, then bound her snout tightly shut to prevent biting, then tied 2 rope leads to each of her front legs. When everything was in place, Han Feng led from the sow's snout. Big Mouth and Monkey each held a front leg rope on either side, letting the sow drag the dead alpha back toward the tribe. Big Mao and Little Mao brought up the rear with sticks, guarding against predator ambush, and occasionally whacking the sow's rear to urge her forward. Just like that, the group cut through the dense forest. Finally, the tribe's cave entrance came into view in the distance. A child clearing brush outside the cave was the first to spot them and shouted the alarm to everyone inside. Soon the whole tribe poured out, but nobody dared approach. They had never seen prey this enormous. The entire tribe formed a wide, silent ring around the boar procession, staring at the largest prey any of them had ever seen. Han Feng called Stonegrinder over and told him to bring a large vat and the salt. He immediately ran to prepare them. When he brought the vat, Han Feng dug a hole in the ground and embedded the vat so its rim sat just above ground level. They all pressed the sow down beside the vat rim, and Han Feng made one precise strike to its neck. Not a single drop of blood spilled outside. All of it sprayed into the vat, filling it quickly. A bowl of salt stirred in, and soon it would congeal into blood pudding for tonight's soup. The tapir boar's hide, once tanned, could be used to make leather shoes or backpacks. These 2 boars would yield so much useful material. Beneath the hide was fat 4 fingers thick to be rendered later. All remaining parts except the lungs, which would be used as fish bait, were edible. Even all the bones, large and small, were sorted out for weapon grinding. Han Feng directed the men to sort every bone by size, smaller ones for tool tips, larger ones for staff points, nothing discarded. It took the entire afternoon for everyone to finish processing the 2,000-pound boars. Very tiring, but the results were deeply satisfying. The smoking rack hung full of large and small strips of meat, 1 vat of congealed blood pudding, 3 vats of white lard. The children grinned widely, picking up crispy cracklings to eat. Even Q Bing was eating happily. Children in small deerskin wraps passed cracklings around the fire. Q Bing, recovered, hair tied back, wearing oversized deerskin, ate with a big smile. When Stonegrinder opened the 3rd kiln firing and began unloading the pieces, the day's work teams had all returned. The fishing team had caught hundreds of fish, an entire backpack of fish alone, plus 2 vats of fish roe. The hunting team was equally impressive. 3 pheasants, 2 large snakes, over 10 bird eggs, over 10 field mice, and a pack of chestnuts, the reliable daily yield. Even more surprising, Ku Bing's auntie, leading the foraging team, had found a new food today, a type of intensely sweet root. Peeled the outer layer, and inside was a thick amber-colored nectar. Han Feng gave her specific praise for this find, quietly nodding his recognition at her discovery. Everyone tasted and loved it, but one person was furious. The elder's face darkened, and he grabbed a thorn-covered stick, chasing Kui Bing's auntie and striking her repeatedly. Seeing this, Han Feng immediately stepped between them and blocked the elder's raised stick, firmly demanding to know, "Explain yourself." The elder's explanation was hard to believe. He said those roots were the bait of the demon tree. Anyone who ate them would be devoured by the demon. Hearing this, Han Feng immediately ordered everyone to stop eating the roots, not because he believed the elder, but because unknown compounds at scale were a liability worth avoiding. Because of this, that night while sleeping, Han Feng stayed vigilant, monitoring every change in his body's sensations. Fortunately, nothing happened all night. When morning came and everyone had gone out, Han Feng arranged the day's work, then took the 4 boys and went with the foraging team. He had to see for himself what the demon tree the elder spoke of actually was.
Han Feng led the 4 boys and joined the forging team, heading up the mountain at first light to investigate the demon tree. The tree was deep in the mountain behind the cave. While moving through the mountain, Han Feng suddenly spotted what he had been longing for day and night: chili peppers, a cluster of fiery red chili plants hiding in the brush. The tribe had never eaten chili. Its burning heat had convinced them it was poisonous. Han Feng immediately ordered the 4 boys to do nothing else today but focus entirely on picking chili right here. He continued forward with the foraging team. Past the ridge, a valley appeared, animal bones visible in all directions, yellowed and scattered like a mass grave. At the center of the valley stood a bizarre tree, roughly 60 meters tall. Its root system sprawled across a 500 square meter area. The denser roots toward the center seemed designed to lure animals closer to the trunk.
At the valley's center, one enormous tree, 60 meters tall, its root system sprawling outward across 500 square meters of bone-strewn ground.
Han Feng read the bone density pattern, converging toward the center in a clear funnel shape. Instinct warned this was a trap.
With his abilities, he was confident he could retreat. He prodded the ground ahead with his spear at each step, advancing slowly. But when the spear tip touched the canopy's shadow zone, a Special Forces soldier's trained instinct fired. Danger was imminent.
Without a word, Han Feng yanked the spear back and retreated 1 step at blinding speed, the bone staff tip barely clearing the canopy line.
Just then, a violent tearing sound ripped through the air from above. Over a dozen spines, nearly 1.2 meters long, plunged straight into the dirt, targeting exactly where his spear tip had touched. The spines were extraordinary, each nearly 1 centimeter in diameter, the shortest over a meter long, with a white flower the size of a bowl at their base.
Weren't these just natural arrows? Han Feng was overjoyed. The ancient stratagem of straw boat borrows arrows suddenly flashed in his mind. He looped vine cord around his carry basket and swung it into the shadow zone as a moving target. In an instant, thwack, 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 over a dozen spines bristled through it. He pulled the basket back, extracted each spine, and repeated the process until he had 2 large bundles, which he carried out balanced across his spear.
Han Feng worked the demon tree systematically. Extend bait, retrieve valley, extract spines, repeat. 2 full spine bundles growing beside him.
Before leaving, he told the women clearly the sweet roots were safe to eat, but only harvest from outside the perimeter line, not a step closer. On the way back, Han Feng collected 100 thumb-thick demon tree saplings, each with perfectly straight trunks, the ideal material for spear shafts. He called the chili-picking 4 boys over, and the 5 of them gathered everything, women with root packs, boys with chili, and loaded up for the return journey.
The group returned to camp, Han Feng carrying spine bundles across his shoulders, youths and women loaded with chili packs and sapling bundles.
Back at the tribe, the children crowded to see what the chief had brought, but in the eyes of the pregnant women, everything Han Feng brought was useless.
Chili, not edible, useless. Sticks too thin to bludgeon prey, useless. But none of that affected Han Feng's excellent mood in the slightest. Peeling the bark revealed very fine, dense, hard grain, cigarette-thick in diameter. Made into arrows, they would be heavy arrows, would reduce range, but penetration would be very strong. And the thumb-thick saplings with their very hard wood only needed to be fire-hardened and one end sharpened, more than sufficient for hunting.
Han Feng showed the youths how to straighten each sapling shaft through fire, then tip it with sharpened bone, a new spear for each warrior. The spear sharpening work was naturally assigned to the 4 boys. In the future, every member of the tribe would be equipped with this new type of spear.
Currently, only a bow was missing. Under current conditions, only a large, heavy bow could be made, but its power would not be weak. Bow materials were plentiful in the boar forest from yesterday, just needed a tree with the right flexibility.
But what Han Feng truly couldn't forget was the aloe vera discovered during the boar hunt. Its leaves were packed with fiber, the best material for rope making, and it could also be woven into fabric for clothing. Not as fine as flax, but far superior to animal hide and much more durable. Most importantly, its sap could treat wounds, both anti-inflammatory and detoxifying, and it could reduce fever and clear heat.
Thinking this, Han Feng planned to begin cultivating aloe vera widely starting next year. When that day came, the tribe would have proper clothing to wear.
And they would significantly reduce the mortality rate from infected wounds suffered during hunts. Winter was still coming, and Han Feng was only getting started.
Subscribe if you want, or just keep scrolling. I'm absolutely sure your boss won't notice you're watching a 3D cat on company time.